Hello and welcome to A Life of Compounding Interest. Thanks for joining us here on YouTube today. We really appreciate it. I wanted to talk a bit about data and statistics, how I use them in my writing, in my book, on this channel, how I sift through it and really implement it in my personal life, and hopefully I can give you some insight and ideas for you to better think about the data and statistics that you're flooded with constantly in today's online world and really just help you make better decisions based off those. Now, if you're new to this channel, what we aim to do is just talk to average people about the bigger problems and questions that we face, like lots of data and how to use it. If we can do one thing out there, it's simply to help people better define what a good life is and execute towards it. But when we talk about statistics specifically, I like to lean into one of my favorite quotes of all time. It came from Mark Twain, and it's "There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. They're all looped in together." Statistics probably being the worst. The reason they're the worst is that we assume that if someone gives us a statistic, then they have some sort of scientific backing. There's methodology that has to happen for those statistics to come out and be viable. Now, when it comes to actually implementing this in a marketing type fashion and how we're generally going to be fed statistics, because they're not going to be through scientific papers or anything like that. They're going to be quotes in books, in articles, somewhere online, God forbid Chat GPT. But we can't really go too far into that conversation in the way that I like to think about it without introducing us to Edward Bernays. Now, if you haven't heard of Edward Bernays, he was a pretty prominent figure in the early 20th century, but his influence stretched all the way through it, seeing as that he was 103 years old when he passed away, and he had worked much longer than anybody would anticipate. Now, Edward Bernays got the title of the father of PR. PR wasn't a thing, public relations. He was able to work with governments and companies alike to help them craft their image and get public opinion on their side. He worked on the propaganda teams for the U.S. All through World War I, through World War II. He also hung around for a lot of nice Cold War era propaganda as well. And when he wasn't working on that, he was helping marketing agencies better sell their products. He had more or less a theory and a system that seemed to be reproducible in all sorts of industries and situations, and it worked. He utilized our self-consciousness and our needs and desires, and he was able to craft messages that more or less gave us solutions. You didn't like something going on in the political sphere? Here's who to blame. Here's what to do. Here's a path forward. It's really simple, but it mobilized people. If you didn't feel cool, pick up this brand of cigarette. And if you're worried about the side effects, don't worry. 4 out of 5 surgeons recommend one specific brand. This is the Edward Bernays influence in marketing, in politics. It's all there. So how does this PR figure really play into how I think about statistics? Well, it starts with think tanks. Now, a think tank is a group of people, mainly scientists, maybe some marketers out there as well, but they work with primarily government institutions to help gather information, do the studies, and present the results. So if I have a problem in the public sphere around healthcare, maybe the military, or social issues, I would go to a think tank and I would present this and I would say, give me the data around this problem and help me build policies that are going to address those big problems and solve them. That's what they do. That can do a whole lot of good and it can do a whole lot of harm. It depends on the motivations and who's signing those checks. If I have a theory or I have a message that I want to promote and I need the scientific data to back up my current position, think tanks can help me with that. But what that does is that creates things like partisan data. We're all familiar with that concept. But on the other side, it can help us with other items, whether that just be overall healthcare of the entire community, something that may not be partisan, that they are genuinely trying to publish information about it and help the general public using that sort of data. So I'm not quick to demonize all think tanks because while they can be weaponized, they can still do a whole lot of good. But the offshoot of those think tanks are corporatized studies. There are tons of regulations around how safe products have to be. And so when we're looking at the hoops that you have to jump through to prove that your product is safe, you're more concerned about the bottom line than safety. And so this gives those corporatized studies the means to bend the data or the studies or the methodologies towards that outcome. They want to get to that positive outcome. Because if they come to a negative outcome, then the project has to be scrapped or reworked, or it's not going to hit the market, and then all the investors lose money. The issue that I have with most statistics and studies are, yes, they're tied to the motives and the purpose of the studies, but there's also efficacy issues that I've seen out there. Now, I've seen studies where, the better part of 95% of the scientists and people doing these studies are actually doing the right thing. They take their job very seriously. They have the methodology that they know that they need to use, and they do. But, sometimes that small fraction that don't follow the rules can do a whole lot of harm. And all the studies do show that those people are out there. They're willing to be dishonest with the numbers. And I have also seen studies where about 2 out of 3 scientists admit to fudging the methodology just a little bit. Now, there's tons of good reasons to do that. Those are not lost on me. I believe that they are still acting in their best interest, but again, 2 out of 3 scientists are willing to admit that some numbers had to be fudged in questionable ways to make that study go out. But more so, 1 out of 3 has admitted to just blatantly ignoring what they should have done and published misleading information. So these are not infallible systems. There's not some magic peer review process that catches every ill intention or every fudged metric. No, they're not perfect. And so I can never be sure what the motivations are of the institutions that are asking for the study, the scientists that are doing the study, and what kind of pressure they're under to produce. And so the outcome, I can only trust so much. I would probably say my trust level with most any study that I come across is going to be about 60, 75% depending on the source. So how do I use statistics? Well, in my book, I quote them 2 different ways. I have direct quoted statistics where I call out the exact study and the exact number that I'm using to base my argument on. And it's not cited in some MLA format at the end. No, it's cited right there in the text. And the reason that I want to cite it there is I want anyone to be able to have that book open and immediately just go to the web and do a Google search, because things today can, one, they can change, new information can come out. And if somebody finds a particular study or a number, I would like them to also be able to see some of the counter arguments that are going to exist, because every statistic has a counterpoint to it. The other way that I like to present them are in ranges. And while they're not directly citable, when you go on a quest to find the answer to a question, you can come across multiple studies. And I found this a lot. I found multiple studies that would point to more or less the same conclusion with slightly different perimeters. Maybe the percentage would be something like 5% one study, 7% in another. And some studies studying the exact same thing might go from 10% to 40%. These ranges around items are very real, and I actually find a ton of value in that. Because if there's a range that big, then I have a harder time taking that as gospel. It becomes more of a theoretical number at that point. So in my writing and in a lot of my work, I might say that there's a range, and that's why. It's because I'm looking at multiple studies and I can't honestly tell you which one I believe the most, but they are all following the same patterns. But that's what I use statistics for, really in my everyday life as well. I use them as an anchor to assess what I think about the world. And is it correct? Am I spot on here, or am I way off? I'll use one example of how I might anchor a statistic in a pretty inconsequential fashion. Let's say that I'm going out to buy a new car. And one of the things that's most important to me is fuel economy. The first thing that I'm going to want to do is go see what the average fuel economy is for US vehicles. I believe it's around 28 miles to the gallon right now. Okay, so if I come back with 28 miles to a gallon as the average vehicle's fuel efficiency, I've got a pretty good idea of what I should expect out of a vehicle. Now, let's say that I have my heart set on a small SUV. That might actually change that fuel economy. So while all vehicles will come in at 28, maybe when I look up the average fuel economy of a small SUV, it's 26 miles to the gallon. Okay, now I've got my initial data. Fuel economy is the most important thing to me. Now I can go to the internet and go look at what kind of car I want. I can start looking at pricing and all that, but fuel economy is still one of my favorite metrics to judge against. I find one vehicle that I like everything about it, and it gets 22 miles to the gallon on average. And I find another vehicle that I like equally as much, and it gets 35 miles to the gallon. Well, if fuel economy is one of my most important metrics, I know that 22 miles to the gallon is lower than most of the things on the market. It's going to end on that lower end. And 35 miles to the gallon is actually probably going to be more of what I want, because fuel economy is important to me. But that large range doesn't necessarily explain good and bad in average terms. Because if there are ones that are closer to that average, I don't feel so bad about it. So maybe if the price is right on one and it comes in at the dead average at 28 miles to the gallon, I don't feel bad because it's not on the lower end. No, it's not as great at the higher end, but it's definitely average. So even if that 28 miles per gallon number is not true, it doesn't necessarily break my entire analytical process for buying a car with fuel economy in mind. And I think that's the other piece that we have to acknowledge. In today's world, going back to I don't trust these statistics to be accurate, whatever argument we're making based on the numbers, if those numbers were slightly different, does the argument still hold up? I do not think that we have the luxury in today's age to go look up on the internet for a number and then be able to come back and say with absolute certainty that we can make this decision. Because with absolute certainty, I should be able to end up with the results that I choose and remove any level of variability from that. That's just not the way that I think things work today. So as you're reading my book, I hope that you see that I take data, while I take it seriously, I try not to, because I'm not basing any of my opinions on the numbers themselves. Yes, I use them to validate what I feel like I'm seeing in the world. I don't base my reality on numbers that I didn't come up with. And that's what I encourage for everyone. If you're looking at a statistic, how does it shape up against your experience in the world? If it is way off, maybe a little bit of research would do some good, or just throw that number out altogether. Those are both fine answers, but as long as we're dealing in low-level decisions, even buying a car is a fairly low-level decision, there is no reason for us to be hell-bent on getting a fully validated statistic. So I really do hope that some of this can lead you to what I explained in my book with the disclaimer in the very front is I think that we should all approach any data that's given to us with a healthy level of skepticism. I don't want the burden of correctness in my book, in my voice, or anything else. I want to be able to give a perspective and use some of the data that's out there to maybe help frame this reality out. If, for whatever reason, you come across a statistic that I give, it doesn't match up, you look it up and you find that it's wildly different, please engage. I welcome that kind of engagement. I like being wrong because that helps me correct my way of thinking and better calibrate it to reality. There's nothing wrong with being mistaken. There's only a problem if you can't accept when you're wrong and adjust. And data, we have to be in pursuit of the good data if we are going to use it as absolute. So I'm going to choose not to use it as an absolute. So thanks so much for listening to this. I don't know if it was too rambly, if it even made sense, but I do feel the weight constantly to feel like I have to be correct in the numbers, in just quoting numbers or stating numbers. And I think we all fall into the bias a little bit of if we look something up online, they return a numerical value, we trust it. Not all science is done with good intent. It's not all done in the proper way. And buried in each one of these studies are tons of details. So please be safe out there when forming your opinions and using data to do it. And I really hope that you will engage with this content, feel empowered to speak up in a friendly manner if you hear something that is just incorrect, because we all need to get better, but also not take any of this too seriously, because at the end of the day, we're all in this to try to learn and just calibrate ourselves in the world, because it's difficult out there. There's tons of numbers, and every point there's a counterpoint, and for every piece of data there's a opposing piece of data that might prove it wrong. We have to be able to make the best decision that we can, and hopefully we can become a trustworthy source for at least well-intended information.